What happened in the deleted scenes from this episode that didn't make the final cut? Why might Damon have put the chopped up futon in the suitcases? Who was Popcorn named after? Keep watching to find out the answers to these questions and more. Welcome to Square Eyes, the channel where we recap, review and take a sideways look at your favourite TV programmes. This video will take a look at the third episode of Series 9 of Inside Number 9, called Mulberry Close. Let's jump straight into the recap. The episode starts with looking through the doorbell camera of Number 9 Mulberry Close, as Damon takes out the rubbish. Then he goes inside and time jumps forward to the next time the motion sensors on the camera are triggered. This time a fox is going through the compost bin, having a midnight feast. Then another of his foxy mates joins him for dinner. Another time jump occurs and it's daylight and Val leaves the house in a hurry, unimpressed that she's got to clear up the mess the foxes have left after going through the bins. Her neighbour Larry asks about the mess and she says she's tempted to put poison down to deal with the problem. Larry suggests a brick instead, and when Val responds with shock, he clarifies that it could be used to weigh down the lid of the bin and deny the foxes access to the delicious compost inside. It all seems like a funny little skip, but this interaction becomes very important at the end of the story. In the next scene we see Ken and Sheila from across the road come over to introduce themselves. Technically the purpose of their visit is to drop off a quiche as a housewarming gift to their new neighbours, but really they want to have a nosey. They try to engage Damon in conversation and get information from him, but he's clearly not interested and shuts down the conversation as quickly as possible, despite their best efforts to get him talking about Sheila's driving lessons and Ken's thoughts on electric cars. Then at night the camera is accidentally triggered by a spider, but it also records the audio of muffled voices in the background arguing. It sounds like Damon and Val inside having a frank exchange of views about how loud the music should be. So we cut to the daytime and things seem harmonious between Val and Damon as they're decorating the front of their house for Halloween. Sheila has seen them setting up and comes over to offer some advice. She suggests that they shouldn't go over the top with their decorations as they don't want to attract undesirables to the close. Val and Damon say it's just a bit of fun, but Sheila is keen to make the point that attracting outsiders is frowned upon by the other residents and it feels a bit awkward. Then we see a spooky figure approaching the doorbell in a hoodie and a skull mask. Though the fear quickly goes away when we see that it's Damon under the mask, he's clearly worse for wear after the Halloween fancy dress at the local pub. Val has to let him in because he hasn't got his key. She's furious with him for reasons that we aren't given, but it's likely that he's let himself down after having a few too many drinks. The milkman triggers the doorbell next, and we can hear Damon and Val arguing inside the house. There are only fragments of the argument that we hear, but Val is angry with Damon for spilling something, and for getting aggressive when he's drunk, and Damon is cross with Val that she left the pub early. They start hurling insults at each other, and there's a horrendous noise of something heavy falling down the stairs, followed by a very heavy thud. It sounds like one of them fell. Next morning, Larry is out walking Popcorn the dog and rings the doorbell on 9 Mulberry Close, but nobody answers. Ken walks past, so Larry asks him if he's heard any loud banging coming from the house late at night. Ken says he hasn't, but suggests to Larry he tries talking to Val because Damon is drunk most of the time. And it's night again, and we see Damon carrying 2 very heavy-looking suitcases out to his car, which might have Val's body in them. That's obviously what Ken and Sheila think, as we see them watching from inside their house over the road briefly, before they quickly switch off their light to avoid detection. The next morning, Ken looks at the spot where Damon was loading the suitcase into the car boot. Is there something there? It's hard to say from his reaction, but it all looks a bit dodgy. We then see Sheila ring the doorbell and ask Damon for the Tupperware bag that the quiche came in. Obviously she's not really bothered about the Tupperware, and it's really an excuse to ask about Val. Damon says that Val's fine and shuts down the conversation, and then he says he doesn't know where the Tupperware is, so Sheila tries to invite herself in to try and look for it, but she gets a very firm no from Damon. It's a funny scenario, because obviously she's worried about Val, but it's still pretty weird to try and force your way into a neighbour's property to look for a plastic tub, so I'm sort of on Damon's side here, even if he's a bit rude in the way he sends her away. Then it cuts to the night time, and Damon drives off in his car. As soon as he leaves, Larry, Ken and Sheila appear, ready to use Larry's spare set of keys to enter the house to see if Damon's really murdered Val. He has a set from when he used to feed the cat for the previous occupants of the house, but when they try the front door it doesn't work. Sheila spots an open upstairs bathroom window, so sends Ken to get some ladders, then tells Larry that she's been logging everything that's been going on at the house. Larry asks her if it's for the police, but she explains it's for a higher authority, the Netflix true crime documentary she anticipates being made about this case. As they're chatting, Sheila spots that there's a back door key, so she goes to check that and appoints Larry as the lookout. His shift as lookout doesn't last 10 seconds as he abandons his post to quieten Popcorn the dog, who is barking loudly back at his house, which is unfortunate as the key worked and Sheila is in the house as Damon inevitably returns back home moments later. He heads straight inside. Larry comes back and starts talking to Sheila in an upstairs window, who asks him to drag a bin over so she can climb down without being detected. As Larry is dragging a bin over, Damon comes out to investigate the noise, and Larry does an unconvincing job of pretending he was confused about the bin days. It gets even more farcical when Ken trots over the road with his ladders, and the best excuse he can offer Damon is that he was willing to do his gutters in the middle of the night if he was interested. Damon seems completely exasperated by their shenanigans, but storms past them and drives off. He'd gone out to fill up his car but forgotten his wallet. His seeming lack of interest in his neighbour's suspicious behaviour is a bit odd, but I suppose it can be explained because he knows how nosy they are, and he's not interested in their weird games that they play. He drives off, leaving Sheila to get out of the house undetected. It's back to daytime again in the next scene, and Damon is outside smoking a cigarette and leaving a voicemail for Val. He apologises for his behaviour the other night and tells her he's cleaned up the mess and he's looking forward to seeing her later, so perhaps she isn't dead after all. Then we see a quick flash of Damon thoroughly cleaning the boot of his car, which would be very suspicious if he'd killed Val, but if she's coming back soon it may just be innocent. Next, Damon pulls into the driveway, jumps out of the car, clearly in an angry mood. He confronts Ken, who's in his front garden raking up some leaves. Damon is livid because a community police officer had visited him at work, and he blames Ken for the intrusion. Sheila hears the fuss and shouts down from her balcony that Damon doesn't have the right to shout at Ken, which prompts Damon to angrily tell her to keep her nose out of his business too. As Damon is listing off the ways that Ken and Sheila have been interfering and spying on him, Larry comes by, walking popcorn. When Larry pretends to know nothing of any conspiracy against him, Damon explains to Larry that he had to be involved as he was the only one that knew where he works and the police met him at his work. The scene on the street ends unpleasantly, with Damon hurling obscenities at his neighbours and threatening Larry that he will regret it if he makes any more accusations against him. Then there's a short clip that shows someone sneaking out of Ken and Sheila's house late at night, and then it cuts away. This will be relevant later. Then we see Larry searching the street and calling out for Popcorn. He's lost his dog. That never ends well for the dog, so don't get your hopes up that we're going to see Popcorn turn up alive and well. Against all expectations, we then see Val make her return to Mulberry Close. As she's putting some rubbish in the bin, she comes across Larry, who's still searching for Popcorn. She tells him that she's been away at her sister's after her and Damon had a huge argument about a futon with wine spilled on it. Damon had thrown the futon down the stairs the other night, which would be the noise that we'd heard on the doorbell camera. He then chopped it up and thrown it out, which is what we'd seen him transporting out to the boot of his car on the camera, making all the mystery relatively innocent in the end. Larry and Val find Popcorn when they open up the bin, as his dead body has been stuffed in there. Despite Val clearly being as shocked as Larry to see the dog in the bin, he immediately accuses Val of killing the dog, recalling the conversation they had at the start of the episode about her poisoning foxes and dumping them in the bin. Val denies this, but Larry is racked with grief and doesn't hear it. Val goes inside to call Damon, but she doesn't get a chance to because Larry follows her inside, taking the brick inside that's been used to keep the compost bin shut. We don't see what he does, but we can hear that he obviously attacks her with the brick. Then Larry walks out, fetches Popcorn's corpse out of the bin, and walks home. We then suddenly shift perspectives from the doorbell camera to the dash cam of a police patrol car that has obviously been called out to the crime scene of Val's murder. It's disorienting to see Mulberry Close from this strange angle, after we've been so used to seeing it from one fixed perspective, but we can see number 9 on the right, with Damon and Val's car in the driveway. Larry and Ken are talking to the police on the pavement outside number 8 on the left, and there's a general buzz in the street as people are trying to work out what's going on. Then we cut to a body-worn camera of a police officer that records Damon being pulled out of the house, protesting his innocence and furious at being escorted out of his house in cuffs. He's driven away to the station, so the officer who is recording ducks under the cordon and stands next to his fellow officer who is interviewing Sheila, Ken and Larry. They're voicing their concerns about Damon based on their snobby opinions about him. The officer is clearly fed up of listening to Sheila, so heads back towards the house and spots the doorbell camera, which prompts him to ask if anyone has checked it. Then we cut to the footage, which is on fast forward until we get to the night before, where we see Sheila sneak out and go for a secret drive in Ken's car. After some grinding of gears, she backs the car out and reverses over Popcorn the dog. We don't actually see the impact, but we do see her get out of the car, fetch up the dog and drop it in the bin where it's later discovered. The episode ends with a voiceover of Michael Ball kicking in, as he's introducing a Netflix documentary about the Mulberry Close murders, and then the credits roll. I really love this episode. I like the way it took a piece of technology that's become everyday and used it as a device to tell a nasty little story that unfolds between neighbours. And even though you think that you know which way the story is going, there's still an interesting twist at the end that was hard to see coming. I enjoyed the suburban setting and could relate to that feeling of being surrounded by nosy neighbours who are constantly scrutinising your every move. While many people talk about loving living in tight-knit communities, I think there's something very claustrophobic and creepy about these kind of environments. This was nicely captured in the not-so-subtle way that Sheila expresses her disapproval of Halloween decorations and her fears of attracting undesirables. I grew up in a small village and found people were often far too interested in each other's business and would dress up their nosiness behind more noble ideas, like they were concerned residents or neighbourhood watch, but really they just want to indulge their desire to know what other people are getting up to, just like we saw with Sheila, Ken and Larry. Having said that, Damon didn't do himself any favours by being so standoffish with his neighbours. Because he didn't engage with them, it meant their imaginations could run wild with the little information that they had, and it set the chain of events for this episode in motion. I don't think Damon is all that nice a guy. He drinks too much, gets aggressive with his partner and destroys furniture. I think the thing is that just because he's unpleasant doesn't mean he's a murderer, and that's the point of the story. We shouldn't jump to conclusions without having all the information. I think the decision to show the bulk of this episode from the perspective of a doorbell camera was an interesting choice. It must have been very limiting in terms of writing the story, but every episode of Inside Number 9 is limited in some way, as they always stick to a single location and a pretty small cast. While it loses something in terms of being able to use interesting camera angles and close-ups, I found it interesting having the single perspective. It made it a bit more like watching a stage play rather than a TV programme, and I liked that. This story made sense being played out mostly on the doorstep, or at least being overheard through the microphone on the doorbell when you couldn't see the action, so it never felt overly contrived. And even though you know this is a scripted drama with actors playing parts, having it done on a found footage style made it feel more gritty and realistic, which adds something to the storytelling. So I think that the things you lose in terms of being limited to a single doorbell camera are more than compensated by the novelty of seeing a story told from this perspective. I really enjoyed how efficiently written this episode was, with almost every single line that was said early in the episode having some resonance later on. The brick that Larry recommended to Val ended up being used to kill her. When she casually threatened to poison the foxes, this was remembered and used by Larry as motivation for a murder. When Ken casually joked about Sheila's bad driving, it then later killed Popcorn the dog. The quiche in the Tupperware is a pretext for one of Sheila's later visits, and also Damon's final verbal swipe at her as he's being carted off to the police station. With episodes of Inside Number 9 being so short, no joke is ever just a joke. They always seem to have a hidden meaning that comes back later to develop the story. That happened over and over in this episode. It's worth watching back again to admire those early scenes. My only real grumble about this episode was Reece Shearsmith's accent, which seemed to be all over the place. When he was calm, he was doing a deep, David Morrissey sort of voice, but when he was angry, it swung into a higher-pitched Roy Chubby Brown northeastern accent. It's not really a big deal, but I think he struggled to pin down a consistent accent for this character. You could also argue that it was a bit weird that Damon chopped up the futon and smuggled it out of the house in 2 different suitcases, but I didn't mind this too much. Obviously it looked like a body, but people do weird things, and if you're fed up of your nosy neighbours watching your every move, I can imagine you might do something odd to try and hide a wine-stained futon to avoid an awkward conversation with the people across the road. I think this was another excellent episode of Inside Number 9, where the team behind the programme have set themselves a tricky creative challenge by filming almost entirely through the lens of a doorbell camera, but they still put together a great half hour of television. It shows that good writing and acting is the most important thing, which is what this episode obviously delivered. My favourite line in this episode came from Damon as he was being carried away by the police at the end of the episode, when he shouted, "You're never going to get your Tupperware back now, are you, Sheila?" I love the pettiness of this line, and how it neatly called back to the scene right at the very start of the episode. It isn't the first episode of Inside Number 9 to rely on security camera footage for a whole episode. Series 2 episode, Cold Comfort, which is set in the offices of an emotional support line, uses the perspective of an office's CCTV cameras for the whole episode, so this is the second found footage episode of Inside Number 9. There was a screening of this episode and the Boo to a Goose episode at the British Film Institute in London to launch the series, and Reece Shearsmith and Steve Pemberton did a question and answer session on the stage afterwards. As part of the interview after the screening, they both confirmed that there were additional scenes that they shot for this episode, which involved deliveries being made to the house of both cleaning products and alcohol. These scenes didn't make it into the final cut due to timing, but also because they gave too much of the story away. Obviously the booze would have been to suggest that Damon was a raging alcoholic, and the cleaning products would have been to clean up the futon, but also to give the impression that it was to clean up a murder scene. At the same Q&A session, Steve Pemberton mentioned that his brother's dog is also called Popcorn, which is where the name for the dog in this episode came from. Reece Shearsmith confirmed that the fox at the beginning of this episode is a real fox. Even though there are 2 on screen, it's actually just one fox that was doubled up using special effects. Apparently the fox wasn't particularly hungry on the day of filming, so they had real trouble getting it to eat the scraps of food from the compost bin. Never work with children or animals, as they say. After the last 2 episodes had very hard to find hares, this episode was much easier to spot, as it was placed in fairly open view when we got to look inside the hallway of 9 Mulberry Close, from the perspective of the police officer's body cam. This episode was heavily inspired by the 1954 film Rear Window. The film is thought to be one of Alfred Hitchcock's best, and is about a man who has broken his leg, and as he recovers he observes his neighbours through his window, and sees what he believes to be a murder. He then enlists the help of his nurse and his wife to try and catch the alleged murderer, so you can see the similarities between this story and this episode of Inside Number 9. The next episode of Inside Number 9 is called Control-Alt-Escape, and is apparently set inside an escape room. Given that Inside Number 9 episodes are always set inside single locations, and tend toward mysterious surroundings, it's a surprise they haven't used an escape room as a premise before now, as it seems like such an obvious place to start one of their stories. It'll be interesting to see how Reece and Steve put their spin on this concept. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If this video has been interesting, and the kind of thing you'd like to have more of in your YouTube feed, then please subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next one. I'll be uploading my video for the next episode shortly. Subscribing also helps to show YouTube that these videos might be interesting to other people too, and helps the channel to grow, so it would really help me out if you could click subscribe. Also, thank you to all those people who subscribed already. Goodbye.